Hi there, happy hump day and welcome to Wednesday. I was reflecting the other day on a trip to London that I had a number of years ago. And if you've ever been to London, you'll remember travelling on the tube and the signage that you see around the tube stations to mind the gap. It's everywhere. And of course, the mind the gap is minding the gap between the platform and the train so that you're taking care of yourself and you're not inadvertently falling between the gap. There's other gaps that can be important to think about. Gaps that impact how we are seen, how we're perceived by others. So we're often reminded to mind the gap in a safety context, but there are other gaps that we need to consider. And the biggest is that gap between our desired behaviour and our actual behaviour. So we all like to think of ourselves in a positive light because we all like to think that we're good people who do good things. And so we construct an image of ourselves, and this image becomes an internal reference point. That internal reference point helps us to make decisions and almost like a dialogue that we construct with ourselves so that we're maintaining that positive image, that sense of ourselves. But our behaviours are influenced by a whole raft of things. And that may mean that we're not as good as we think we are. We're not living up to that internal image that we have of ourselves. Now, there's two key factors at play: espoused values and values in use, and moral licensing. So in psychology terms, your espoused values and your values in use were terms that were coined by Argus and Shawn back in 1974. And your espoused values, they're the values that you talk about. So your values that you might talk about is you can talk about that you value the environment or you value caring for others. Your values in use are your actual behaviours. They're the demonstration of how you're living out your values. So I've seen examples where people will say, I really value the environment. That's my espoused value. But I'm getting annoyed if someone wants to take away my plastic bag. So that's my values in use. And you can see how there's a contradiction between the two. There's a gap between the two. So what could some of those gaps be for you? Where are those occasions where what you say you want, what you say you're living up to, isn't what translates in reality? The other thing is it can become even trickier when you realise that the act of doing something good can then mean that later in the day, because you feel good about yourself, it gives you permission to be not quite so good later in the day. And this is what we call moral licensing. So for example, you may have had a really productive morning. You're feeling great because you've got all of these things done. You've chocked all those stuff off your to-do list. But then oddly, that then gives you the permission to feel like you can cruise in the afternoon. Or you've gone to the gym in the morning, and so you're giving yourself the treat in the afternoon of ice cream or a piece of chocolate cake. So this moral licensing means that a good deed at one part of the day, which boosts your image of yourself, then oddly creates this permission for you to do something later in the day that isn't quite so good. So you can think of it like a series of checks and balances. Your brain has got an image of yourself and it wants to maintain that image. And so it's keeping score of the things that you do that are good and of the things that you're doing that are not so good. You're earning credits for good behaviour and you're earning debits for not so good behaviour. The eventual aim is to balance those scales. Researchers at Northwestern University ran a series of experiments to demonstrate how that works in practice. And what they found was that priming people, so setting them up to feel good about themselves by getting them to think about positive traits and then also negative traits, strongly affected their behaviour. It led to people behaving either less morally, in the case of those who had been primed to think about positive traits, and more morally for those who are being encouraged to think about negative traits. Now, all of this happens most often subconsciously. And because we have that strong urge and desire to maintain a positive image of ourselves, we're going to rewrite the narrative when we've done something that doesn't quite live up to our expectations. So it's really important to really be aware, where are those occasions that there are gaps for you? What are the safeguards that you need to put in place? And it can start with being really clear on what your values are, and it helps to write them down. It also helps to have a trusted advisor. It could be a partner or a friend. For me, I know it's my husband, Craig. He's the person who pulls me up when I'm not really living according to who I want to be. He's the one who can help hold up that mirror to me, to challenge me about how things really are. If you're a leader, make sure you're giving your team permission to challenge you and to ask questions. And when you're faced with a behavioural dilemma, ask yourself, am I the kind of person who, and then insert that behaviour. Because if that's not who you want to be, then you need to check yourself and challenge yourself. And then lastly, at the end of each day, reflect on your behaviour, what you've done, what you've said, and what you haven't done and haven't said, to see whether your espoused values and the values that you've demonstrated through the day, whether they're in line with each other. It was the Dalai Lama who said, open your arms to change, but don't let go of your values. That's so important. So lots to think about this week. I hope you're staying well. Take care, and I'll see you next week.